Hello and welcome. I'm Leigh-Ann Gerrans and you're watching W News, broadcasting live from the Arabiya headquarters. We continue our live coverage of the Israel-Iran conflict. Stay with us for in-depth analysis coming up throughout the show. European leaders, including officials from the UK, Germany and France, are in Geneva in a bid to prevent further escalation between Iran and Israel. This marks the first diplomatic gathering since the conflict began, with the top priority being a return to negotiations. Iran is also participating in these very talks. I'm now joined by former British MP and former chair of the UK Defence Select Committee, Tobias Alwood. Tobias, always a pleasure to have you on the show. So the UK, France and German foreign ministers are holding talks with their Iranian counterpart in Geneva today as part of efforts to ease the Israel-Iran tensions. But what difference will this make 8 days into the conflict that is continuing?
Well, good evening. And European leaders, when they do get together, are normally discussing Ukraine and what's going on with Russia. And now they're meeting to talk about something which the world has been watching very, very carefully, very concerned about where it might go. The world does feel a little less dangerous, I think, than 24 hours ago, as Trump pauses his plans to wade in. But this is only temporary. And this is why these back-channel discussions, these negotiations, are very, very important indeed, because the prospect of potential escalation, miscalculation, even poor decision-making remains very, very high indeed. It's been quite a roller coaster. I mean, Trump was angry clearly at the beginning with Israel, who orchestrated these attacks, as America was conducting its own negotiations with Iran, but had no choice then to wade in and support Netanyahu after he launched those attacks. Trump calling for unconditional surrender, telling residents to leave Tehran, but then persuaded, and this is the interesting piece, by his own National Security Council and by the international community, saying, you know, hitting Iran is the easy part. What follows, especially if the regime falls, is less straightforward. And experience in Afghanistan, in Iraq, illustrate, you know, what is your plan for the day after? And there clearly isn't one right now. So it's absolutely vital that we take this window, this 2-week opportunity, to look more carefully at the long-term strategic planning that might take place, the off-ramp, if you like, that leads us into a place where Iran is without a nuclear bomb, where Iran does not have that toxic influence across the Middle East, but avoids an all-out war.
So, Tobias, you're just talking there about US intervention and the fact that these talks do come after President Trump said he would decide whether to join Israeli military strikes on Iran within 2 weeks. I found the word within quite interesting because it just remains unclear. But do you think that this is to give time for negotiations or for America to secure military support in the region? Because we do know a lot of military hardware is being moved by the US into the Middle East.
Yes, and it's absolutely right. I mean, Britain's doing this as well. It's absolutely right to take precautionary measures to move military assets into the region. But I go back to the point, which is important, that Netanyahu has dragged Trump into this. And Trump then realized, hang on, I've been elected to stop wars, to get America out of wars, not to get sucked into them. And so much as there was this rhetoric on the social media, it's very, very clear that America is reluctant. Otherwise, they would have plowed in. They would have got engaged already. So I believe Donald Trump himself is looking for a way out of this, but also realizing, too, that, Iran has never looked weaker than it does today. It's been a real thorn in America's side since the revolution itself, since those hostages were taken in 1979, 1980, since Iran was such a poisonous influence in Iraq after the 2003 involvement. And then, of course, Iran losing its proxy influence because Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis have been pushed back. Syria has fallen too, Iran's best friend. So is there ever been a better opportunity to perhaps develop a new chapter with Iran? These are the bigger questions that's going to oblige a little bit of statecraft to make sure that we make those right decisions and avoid an all-out war.
So you're just speaking there about this all-out war, but you were a former British Army officer with lots of experience, Tobias, in the Middle East. If we see an escalation between Israel and Iran, and I know you're saying Donald Trump right now is holding off US involvement, but what threat does this actually pose to the region? Like you said, we've seen Syria fall. It could be a good time right now because it is a weakened Iran, but what's the ramifications?
Well, it's interesting that, people are now swatting up and learning a bit more about what Iran is all about. For most of Europe, they don't appreciate that it's actually the size of Western Europe. 92 million people there, not really enjoyed democracy at all. And if you're going to lift the lid off an oppressed population and suddenly expect democracy to flourish, you've got another thing coming. Take a look at Syria. We were just discussing there. Assad, the dictator, has gone, replaced by an old Al-Qaeda boss. So what would happen is probably civil war. But even before we get there, it's likely that if this war persisted or elevated, the regime would go down fighting. It still has a lot of ballistic missiles left. If they were targeting American assets in Iraq and so forth, it would then impact on the economy, the Straits of Hormuz, the Red Sea, and so on, with wider ramifications for the entire global economy. These are very difficult times indeed. There's no doubt about it. But America's hesitance here, I think, is an indication to say it doesn't want to get involved, and it is looking for a different direction of travel. It's very easy, as I say, with superior weapons, with intelligence, to blast the regime into oblivion. It's much more difficult to find a long-term peace and stability. That is the difficult piece, and that's why capital cities across Europe and beyond are scratching their heads.
Tobias Alwood, former British MP and former chair of the UK Defence Select Committee, thank you for your insights. Let's continue this conversation now with Elica Ashuri, British-Iranian activist and also an actress. Elica, it's a pleasure to have you on. As the war between Israel and Iran hits the 1 week mark, Iranians have spent nearly half of the conflict in a near communication blackout, really creating an uneven picture of the war with Israel. How concerning is this for you personally?
Yes, on a personal level, I have a very immediate family and friends who are currently living in Iran, in Tehran. My own grandmother, who is 92 years old, lives by herself in Tehran, and she has no means or anywhere she could really go. And from today, we've actually lost any sort of communication with her as well due to the blackout. I've had friends who have evacuated Tehran and gone up north, like many others, but that in itself comes with an array of troubles because they have left their jobs, they've dipped into their savings, there's a scarcity of oil, there's scarcity of food. And today we've seen that Israel has also bombed the north of Iran, where everyone has evacuated to. So there's a multifaceted issue here brewing that no one can see an end to at the moment.
And crowds have gathered for Friday prayers across Iran after the regime calls for a big turnout, as many people protest against Israeli attacks. Has support for the regime strengthened in light of Israeli attacks from the information that you're getting out of Tehran?
I think we need to distinguish here the support for the regime and the people who support it and the people who live in Iran and who've had enough of this government, and that is the majority of people. I mean, Iran is an extremely big country, so even a small fraction supporting the regime might seem like a big number, but it's not, because more than 80% of the population wants a regime change. And the problem here stems from the division between the groups that want a regime change and where this regime change should go. So I don't think it's the supporters of the regime that are of an issue right now, but rather the response that we receive from the people who want the regime gone to the war and to the attack of Israel to Iran.
And Israel launched its attacks on Iran in order to target its military sites and ballistic infrastructure. But there has been speculation about Israel's desire for a regime change. And you're just talking to me a little bit about it there. But if it does happen and the regime does change, what does the future look like for Iran?
First of all, I don't think that Israel's attack on Iran is altruistic. I think there has been ample time in the last 40 years where Western powers could have restricted the regime and helped the people of Iran with regime change. I feel like bombing for liberation is a paradox, and it doesn't work. It's never worked in the history of the Middle East. And I believe that Israel at the moment might have a plan B for when the regime changes, where someone they have maybe pre-chosen comes to power, but that would make Iran a client state again, which would be a repeat of why we had a revolution in the first place, where people were unhappy with the regime of the time. And on the other hand, if the regime does fall, we need to really seriously, as a nation, sit down and allow the people of Iran to make a decision about what comes next. We need to make sure that we have infrastructure for democracy, because Iran has had the infrastructure for democracy in place. There is a process for elections at the moment, albeit rigged. People are familiar with the democratic process. They just hadn't had an honest one. So we need to make sure that this regime fall will not be hijacked by those who want to abuse this power vacuum and by those who would then subsequently become a puppet to a Western power.
And your father was released from an Iranian prison alongside Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe, a moment many of us do remember. How is your father following his release?
My father has tried to cope. I mean, there have been many instances of a series of depression, having to deal with the issue, but he's also channeled it into something really positive, where he has run 4 marathons now, raising money for charities like Amnesty International and Hostage International, who are really supportive in the release of my father, and also currently in support of hostages in Iran. And we just get by, and we've not really been able to disconnect with the issue since the Woman Life Freedom happened shortly after his release. So we've been constantly busy campaigning for human rights, for women's rights in Iran. And that's, I believe, how we stay connected to the issue and how we try to heal.
Elica Ashuri, British-Iranian activist and actress, I do hope that your grandmother is safe and well, and I wish you all the best. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Now, Iran's foreign minister has ruled out any negotiations with the United States as long as Israel continues to strike Iran. However, he did make it clear that his position does not apply to Europe, adding that his country has always maintained dialogue with European leaders. Take a listen.
It is the Americans who are seeking negotiations, but we have explicitly told them that as long as the aggression and attacks continue, there is simply no room for talk of dialogue or diplomacy. We are in a legitimate state of self-defense. We have no discussions with the United States, which we see as Israel's partner in crime. We have always had dialogue with the Europeans and have discussed various issues with them. Even now, if they have something to say, we are listening. We are not ashamed of defending the rights of the Iranian people, and we are not avoiding anyone.
I'm now joined by Christophe Lemoine, spokesperson for the French Ministry for Europe and Foreign Affairs. Christophe, thank you so much for joining me. President Macron has been speaking today, calling for a return to negotiations. UK, French and German foreign ministers are holding talks with their Iranian counterpart in Geneva today. What difference can today's talks make as the strikes do continue between Israel and Iran?
As you know, France and the European partners never gave up on negotiation with Iran. That's what we've been doing for the last 20 years, and that's what we've been doing for the last 2 years when Iran was escalating with its nuclear program. What's new in the situation now is that there are, strikes between Iran and Israel, and this escalation presents different risks for the stability of the region. So France is convinced that the only way forward is to go with the negotiation and to go back to the negotiation table. This is what we're doing today in Geneva with our British and German partners and the Iranian Minister for Foreign Affairs.
How much sway does France have over the US? Because we saw Trump hastily left the G7 and he actually lashed out at President Emmanuel Macron. He said, Emmanuel always gets it wrong. Were you expecting such a position from the US president?
Well, the strength of the French position is that we've been consistent. And we've been consistent in saying that there is no other solution than negotiation. So this is what I think Emmanuel Macron expressed during the G7 summit in Canada last week. And this is what he said, especially to President Trump. Again, there is no military solutions to the nuclear crisis in Iran. The only way forward is negotiation. And I think this is the strength of the French position, is that we've been consistent with that for the last years, and I think Iranians know it.
And there was meant to be a French-Saudi summit happening right now in New York to announce the recognition of Palestine as a state. Has Israel's war on Iran weakened the invitation to recognize a Palestinian state? Has that now been forgotten by France?
Absolutely not. The conference on the two-state solution was a conference that was carried by France and Saudi Arabia in the perspective of trying to find out a political solution to the crisis in Gaza and in the West Bank. This conference was postponed due to logistical consideration. Indeed, with the airspace closed in Israel, it was impossible for President Abbas to reach New York. So the conference is postponed, but it's still very high on the priorities of the French government.
And if we're talking about US involvement when it comes to Israel and Iran, that's something Donald Trump says he's going to make that decision within 2 weeks. What's the message from the French government on involvement from the US in this conflict?
Well, the message from France is very simple, is to avoid escalation. The military operations that are happening right now are already very dangerous for the region and for the stability of the region. And further operation and more operation will endanger very seriously the stability of the region. So the message is very clear, is de-escalate and go back to the negotiation table.
And what threat does escalation actually bring to the Middle East region?
Well, the escalation is very dangerous. There is a risk that the situation will get out of hand, and in a region that is already, with instability. So this is, there is something very dangerous in escalating in the Middle East.
Macron is warning against the temptation to force regime change in Iran. Why is he calling that a strategic mistake?
Well, because, he refers to past experiences of, regime change from the exterior with military operations, and that never worked. But also, and I think this is the most important, Emmanuel Macron recalls that the main point of the crisis today is the Iranian nuclear program. This is what has to be tackled. This is not a question of regime change. The first priority is tackling with the nuclear program of Iran.
So what solutions can France offer as a party with historical credibility in the Middle East?
Well, first of all, and this is what President Macron announced this morning, France will offer a package for Iran, a package with 4 items in it. A first item on the nuclear program, a second item on the ballistic program, another item on releasing all the hostages that are held in Iran, and a fourth item about, the global security in the region. And this package is discussed at the moment in Geneva between the French minister and his British and German counterparts, and then it will be presented to the Iranian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So we hope that this package could offer a good platform to start the discussions on.
So you talk about the package there that can be offered by France. They're talking about it in Geneva today. But as we are talking, there's still strikes happening between Israel and Iran, and civilians are dying in both countries. Is this enough, or does something more need to be happened? Because we know negotiations take a long time, and can the world just set back and let this carry on?
This is the call that President Macron repeated this morning. Each civilian died is one civilian too much, and those operations must stop right away.
And then when we're talking about citizens, French citizens in Iran and in Israel at the moment, what is the government doing to support those people in the region and make sure that they are safe?
Well, this is the priority of the French diplomatic services in Israel and in Iran. The Minister of Foreign Affairs, Jean-Noël Barrot, made very important announcement yesterday as far as the help that will be offered to the French citizens living in Iran and French citizens living in Israel. They'll be offered now the possibility, if they want, on a voluntary basis, to leave those countries and to be able to be back safe in France. And this is what is carried out at the moment by the crisis center of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in France here in Paris.
And Christophe, we obviously can't ignore the situation that's happening in Gaza, and a joint statement from the leaders of the UK, France and Canada on the situation in Gaza and the West Bank wasn't that many months ago. It was condemning Israel's actions. Do you still feel the same way, and do you support them more on the issue in Iran than on the issue in Gaza?
No, absolutely. We're still very focused as well on the situation in Gaza. And in this situation, again, we've been calling for a political solution with a two-state solution that will be able to give both Israelis and Palestinians the possibility to live in safety and in security next to each other. And that, we think, is still one priority that we have to carry. And we were talking about this conference on the two-state conference. This conference will have to happen, and will have to happen soon, so that we'll be able to move on this issue as well, because this is also a situation that is not bearable. As operation continues, as the humanitarian aid is blocked, as there are still civilians dying in Gaza, this has to stop. And the only way out, there again, is a diplomatic way, is a political way to be able to build, a strong political process.
And Christophe, just before I let you go, you did mention the nuclear talks that were happening with Iran, but they were in discussions, in negotiations with the US ahead of this Israeli attack on Iran. Do you believe that Iran was close to producing a nuclear weapon, or maybe they weren't? What do you think the situation there is?
Well, the situation is that in the last 2 years, Iran has been, moving on with its nuclear program, and they've been, gaining steps and steps and steps. And so we've been condemning it constantly, but Iran was very active. So I cannot tell you if they were close or not close to have a nuclear weapon. What is true is that they were moving on very quickly, and this was a great matter of concern.
Christophe Lemoine, spokesperson for the French Ministry for Europe and Foreign Affairs. A pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Let's take a look at some of the other stories making the headlines today. US baseball team, the Los Angeles Dodgers, say they blocked immigration agents from entering the stadium on Thursday. However, ICE have denied requesting permission to access the parking lots of the stadium. This follows the team announcing its plans to help immigrant communities harmed by recent raids by ICE. Now, China's military has criticized the sailing of a British warship through the Taiwan Strait as a deliberate attempt to undermine peace and cause trouble. Britain's Royal Navy says its patrol vessel made a routine navigation as part of a long-planned deployment. China considers the strait to be Chinese waters, although Taiwan and the US say it's an international waterway. Now, the president of the Washington-based Saudi American Public Relations Affairs Committee has rejected claims that executed terrorist convict Turki Al-Jasser was a journalist. The Saudi Ministry of Interior announced the death of Al-Jasser after he was convicted of multiple offences, including high treason through espionage. Earlier, I spoke to Saudi geopolitical researcher Salman Al-Ansari, who did address this very matter.
Yeah, thank you, Leigh-Ann, so much for having me. And as we have seen, that Turki Al-Jasser is literally a terrorist, a traitor, and he had nothing to do with journalism. And that claim of him being a journalist by some media outlets have been just a fabrication. He basically worked in a sensitive government agency, and he had access to classified information. He served a full prison sentence, which was like 4 years, and was released, something that wouldn't happen in the case there were political motivation behind his imprisonment. But after his release, he was recruited, and this is the new thing that I didn't even mention in the thread, he was recruited by a woman working for a regional intelligence agency. And he resumed his activities, this time more dangerously, engaging in the planning and financing of terrorism. He was convicted of espionage and high treason, and they're both definitely like the Saudi legal system, which is the case for any other responsible country. They would take the high treason crime as a very top crime. And it's just very unfortunate seeing how some international media have been using that case and claiming that he was a journalist, which he wasn't. And we have actually seen a pattern, Leigh-Ann. Like, we have seen a pattern that was like a couple of decades ago. We can remember how the Western media used to label Osama bin Laden. They were actually labeling him as a freedom fighter because of his role against the Soviets. And the Saudis stripped Osama bin Laden from his nationality, and they called him a dangerous terrorist. They labeled him as a terrorist. But unfortunately, the West didn't take the Saudi heat seriously until we saw what happened in 9/11. The same goes with the other guy, Abdul Muhsin Talib, who was a terrorist and who came from Saudi Arabia, and he was a fugitive in Germany. And the Saudi government asked to extradite him from Germany, but he was labeled in the German press as a human rights activist. And the Saudi government warned the Germans that he is not a human rights activist, he's just an extremist and terrorist. And he ended up killing many civilians in Germany a couple of months ago. So, yeah.
Now, Israel's strikes on Iran's nuclear sites are raising concerns, though experts say the risk of contamination so far does remain low. They also cautioned, however, that this could quickly change if the Bushehr nuclear plant is attacked, potentially leading to a nuclear disaster. Earlier today, the Israeli military claimed it had targeted this Russian-built facility, but later did retract that very statement. For more on this, let's go live to Washington to speak to Andrea Stricker, Deputy Director of FDD's Non-Proliferation and Biodefense Programme. Absolute pleasure to have you on the show. The head of the UN atomic watchdog is warning that an Israeli strike on Iran's southern nuclear plant could trigger a regional disaster. If Israel ignores these warnings, how severe would the consequences be?
Great to be with you, Leigh-Ann. I think we don't have any information that Israel will in fact target Bushehr. There's no reason that they would want to create a radiological disaster. And from a non-proliferation standpoint, the Bushehr reactor really doesn't pose a threat for nuclear weapons development. It has a level of plutonium that is a byproduct from operating the reactor. But it's not the ideal plutonium that Iran would want. And so I would expect that Jerusalem will stay far away from this facility.
And what is the major concern? Which facilities are raising concern in Iran if they were struck by Israel?
Well, we saw Israel strike the Arak reactor, and that was not a concern because it was not operable. It didn't have fuel rods inside. And so that's why we saw them take out that facility. There's really limited radiation risk, to be honest. When we're talking about impacting enriched uranium stockpiles or enriched uranium plants where they make that material, the risk is really localized. You would have to have workers or recovery teams wearing protective gear for a time. There would be a release of different chemical particles and alpha particles. But it would dissipate over time and it would remain local to the facility. When we saw the Natanz pilot enrichment plant destroyed a few days ago, the IAEA, the UN nuclear watchdog, reported very little problem with radiation at that facility.
And Andrea, back in August 2024, you did write a piece and you said Iran was shockingly close to nuclear breakout potential. The world must act. How close is Iran to having a nuclear weapon? And in many ways, why were these warnings ignored?
Well, from our estimates, they had enough enriched uranium to make up to 22 nuclear weapons, and they could make that weapons-grade material within 5 months. And there's an estimate of about 6 months to create a crude nuclear device, so something more rudimentary than what would go on a missile, but could be delivered via truck or plane or other ways. And I think the Israelis, from my understanding, took action now because they had seen growing indications of activities related to constructing nuclear devices among the Iranians. The US differed in its interpretation overall about the urgency of that. They saw more research efforts, but the Israelis, with a country the size of New Jersey, really were not willing to wait until the Iranians put together a nuclear device and made good on their threat to possibly deliver it.
So with Israel targeting Iran's nuclear facilities at the moment, we're seeing rising tensions both between India and Pakistan and the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war. Is the world edging closer to a possible nuclear radiation incident happening?
I think my concern is mostly with the Russian role taking over the Ukrainian nuclear power plant, Zaporizhzhia. There have been numerous incidents where the plant's safety and security was put at risk, and the UN nuclear watchdog was very concerned about a radiological disaster, given the fighting and impacts to the plant. Pakistan and India is also a concern. There is nothing really to stop the two from escalating from that situation spinning out of control, except for the threat of mutually assured destruction and the threat that they would do serious damage to their populations respectively if they traded nuclear launches. So there are many things to be concerned about right now with nuclear weapons use. Let's hope that cooler heads prevail, though, in all of these situations.
And also, I just wanted to ask you, what do we know about Iran's secret nuclear mountain, Fordo? This has been spoken about a lot since this conflict did break out, since the strikes between both Israel and Iran. And do we have any idea what its uranium enrichment capacity actually is?
We do. By last count from the IAEA's inspections, they had about 2,100 operating centrifuges, some others that were being installed. And the plant has the capacity to make about 9 to 10 nuclear weapons worth of weapons-grade uranium within a few weeks. So it does pose a serious threat. And as we know, it's very deeply buried, around 60 to 90 meters below a mountain. Very difficult for the US and the Israelis to eliminate it, although they could do some serious damage and possibly take it out fully if US bunker buster bombs came into play.
And Andrea, there have been reports of neighbouring countries taking precautions as global fears of nuclear contamination do actually grow. We've seen social media users in the region, they're sharing advice about what to do in an event of a possible nuclear leak. And this is something that is concerning many people. What are the correct steps to take if this does actually happen and the best way to protect themselves?
I believe that if there were some kind of incident involving a nuclear reactor, which we don't expect because Israel does not want to cause this kind of a regional disaster, people should probably evacuate and listen to authorities and take any protective gear measures that their governments offer. Again, I don't think people need to be too concerned because Israel has enough to deal with the strikes that it's taking now, and likely doesn't want to cause additional concern for countries in the region.
Andrea Stricker, thank you so much for joining us. Deputy Director of FDDS Non-Proliferation and Biodefense Programme. A pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you.
Let's take a look at the top business news now. Oil prices fell on Friday following the White House's decision to delay U.S. involvement in the Israel-Iran conflict. However, they still remain on course for a third consecutive weekly rise. Brent crude futures were down $2.57 to $76.28 a barrel. Japan's core inflation hit more than a two-year high, and that was last month, exceeding the central bank's 2% target for over 3 years. There's been pressure to resume interest rate hikes despite pressure from the US tariffs. Japan's economy has been fragile following President Trump's trade policy. Let's go to the sports news now, and Liverpool have agreed a £40 million deal to sign defender Milos Kerkez from Bournemouth. The 21-year-old Hungarian will join the Premier League winners after 2 seasons with the side over in Dorset. And the British tennis player Jacob Fernley has been knocked out at Queen's by Jiri Lecheka, losing 7-5, 6-2 in the quarterfinals. Things had been looking pretty good for the British number 2 after his first break of the match, but he actually failed to deliver following 3 double faults. And that's all from us on W News. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and also follow us on X. Counterpoints with Melinda Nusifora will be coming up next. Plus, don't miss highlights of this week's W News Extra, and that's up in a couple of hours' time. Goodbye and thank you for joining us.